Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our final class meeting. So as you guys are getting signed in, just a few final points of house cleaning. So I am, as usual, slammed on grading, but particularly so because it's the end of the semester and I have a huge pile, not a literal pile because I don't print them out, but I have about 200 essays on my queue that I have to get graded in the next week. So thank you for your patience on your grades on the third essays. I really do try to put some thought into the feedback that I give on those essays. So it takes me a little bit of time to get them done, and I apologize for it taking a little bit longer than we would all prefer. And I am also finishing up the final touches on your final exam, which I will have released to you guys tomorrow. I will also have a study guide that I will post. I am anticipating 50 to 60 multiple choice questions covering chapters 12 through 15. It will be open book with a time limit like I've talked about before. So keep an eye out for that to be released tomorrow. I'll also send an email out when that's ready for you guys. So today is our final class meeting, and before we cover chapter 15, I just wanted to say that it's been a pleasure being your instructor. It's always an honor to be able to do what I do for a living. I don't take it for granted. I consider this to be quite a privileged position that I'm in. I get to interact with students and talk about interesting ideas and hear my own voice, and I get paid for it, right? And I haven't suffered any job loss as a result of the pandemic, and I count myself to be an insanely fortunate person to be able to do what I do for a living. And I'm immensely thankful for all of you and all of the awesome conversations that we've had in class, and for you guys just being awesome students, regardless of all the stress that we've been going through as the result of the pandemic and rolling with the punches with the changes. So again, an honor and a privilege, and this will be our last class meeting together today. So today we're going to cover chapter 15, which covers the topic of psychological treatments. Now, this is an area that people spend years in graduate school studying. You could easily spend 2 or 3 years as a graduate student or more working on a master's degree, or 5 to 7 years working on a PhD in this stuff. So we're talking about a huge area that encompasses mental health treatment, and we're giving it the most shallow treatment, the most general treatment, so that we're not able to go into any significant level of depth in this chapter. I'm in a little over an hour. I'm covering an area of expertise that people literally spend years studying. So with that caveat, I will do my best to try to give you guys a good overview crash course of the field of mental health treatment, particularly as it's subdivided into the realms of psychotherapy and the realm of psychiatry. So we're going to look a little bit at psychotherapy today, and we're going to look a little bit at psychiatry. So these are two different but overlapping fields in the sense that they're both aimed at treating mental health disorders, at treating psychopathology. So let's start by looking at some of the heavy hitters when it comes to psychotherapy. All right, so we'll do a quick overview of the field of psychotherapy, and then we'll do a quick overview of the field of psychiatry, and then that's it for this course. So when we talk about psychotherapy, we're talking about any form of mental health treatment that aims to treat psychopathology through a therapeutic relationship between a client and a therapist, or in an old school the old school terminology might have been the doctor and the patient, right? But the term client is usually used these days for whatever reason. And I guess it's just more humanizing to a lot of folks, with the exception of psychiatrists. Psychiatrists are medical doctors, so they tend to still use the word patient. But psychotherapists tend to use the word client these days instead of patient. But tomato, potato, whatever. So psychotherapy is a therapeutic relationship. That's at least the aim. There's an emotional bond and an interpersonal bond that forms between the client and the therapist. And the goal of psychotherapy is to work through whatever psychopathology or mental distress that person is experiencing. And the idea is that that relationship will form an opportunity for these issues to be discussed in a meaningful way that will lead to behavioral change, that will lead to a change in the way the person thinks about things, and ultimately a change in the person's long-term emotional state for the better. All right, so that's the general idea behind psychotherapy. That's what all forms of psychotherapy have in common. With that said, there are a lot of different approaches to psychotherapy. Today, we are going to talk about some of the major approaches to psychotherapy that have been most influential in the history of the field. So I'm certainly not going to be talking about every single approach to psychotherapy that's ever been devised. That would take years, literally years, to study all of them in any sufficient level of depth. But we're going to talk about the major theoretical orientations that have been the heavy hitters that have been the most influential in influencing the history of psychotherapy. So no discussion of the history of psychotherapy and of psychotherapeutic methods would be complete without talking about our dear friend Sigmund Freud, who we've talked a lot about already in this class. And as we know, Freud was under the belief that most mental distress resulted from unconscious conflicts, meaning that the subconscious part of the self, which comprised the largest part of the self, according to Freud. What we're aware of is just the tip of the iceberg, as we've talked about. Freud believed that most of the self existed in the subconscious, and the structures of the id and the superego, and that the conscious self, the ego, was just a tiny little bit of who we actually are. And he believed that mental distress was caused by the fact that aspects of ourself that are too scary to face get suppressed into the subconscious, where we lose conscious awareness of them, but yet they still affect our behavior on an unconscious level. That's the basic idea, right? There are things about ourselves that are so scary that we can't face them, that we push them deep into the depths. And the idea basically is that monsters grow in the dark, right? And Freud believed that if you expose the monsters to the light of day, they would get smaller and lose their power. So the idea behind Freudian psychotherapy, which was known as, or is known as, psychoanalysis, is to unearth these monsters lurking in the depths of your subconscious, and to expose them to the light of day. And once you do so, you will alleviate whatever mental distress it is that the client is suffering from. That's the basic idea. So this idea of talk therapy actually wasn't original to Freud. He often gets credit as being the father of psychotherapy because he kind of was, but he actually didn't really invent the idea. It was actually one of his mentors in medical school who actually coined the term the talking treatment, or the talking cure, as he called it. And that mentor was one of his professors in medical school, who was named Joseph Breuer. And Breuer kind of started to realize in his career that if you just let patients talk about whatever it was that was bothering them, that this would often alleviate some of their distress. And Breuer referred to this as the talking treatment. And he was one of Freud's mentors, and Freud kind of borrowed this idea, but he took it and ran with it, and he developed it to a level that Breuer never did. So although Breuer was kind of the initial person to come up with the idea, it was really Freud who really took the idea and fully formed it into what became known as modern day psychotherapy. Another person who influenced Freud was a mentor, another professor by the name of Jean-Marie Charcot, who was one of his mentors when he went to medical school when he was in Paris. And both Charcot and Breuer were big proponents of hypnosis. So earlier in Freud's career, Freud was really big on the idea of hypnosis. In fact, he was completely obsessed with hypnosis early on in his career. Prior to that, Freud was obsessed with cocaine. And Freud believed that for a while that cocaine was going to be the cure-all. In fact, he promoted cocaine as a cure for depression and a cure for exhaustion. And it wasn't until later that Freud became aware of its addictive properties and how it could actually be really harmful to a person's health. But so Freud's original obsession was with cocaine. Once he got away from cocaine, then he moved on to hypnosis. And Freud was quite enamored with hypnosis for a number of years early in his career due to the influence of Breuer and Charcot. But Freud quickly became disillusioned with hypnosis as well when he realized that it wasn't as effective as Freud hoped that it would be. And Freud developed some leeriness about hypnosis because Freud came to realize, as we now know from modern cognitive psychology, that you could actually inadvertently implant false memories in people's minds through hypnosis, through suggestibility. And that's something that Freud actually became aware of years before Elizabeth Loftus did her famous work on false memories. So Freud became disillusioned with hypnosis as well. And he eventually ended up settling on his two major methods that he stuck with for the rest of his career, which were free association and dream analysis. So the idea of free association was that he would have his clients lay down on a couch facing the ceiling, looking away from him, so that they would feel free to share what was ever on their mind. And in that way, they're not looking Freud in the face, so they feel more free to speak because they're not making eye contact with Freud or the therapist. Freud trained a lot of people in this method. There was a circle of devotees of Freud's that formed in Vienna in the late 1800s and early 1900s, and this group of psychoanalysts became known as the Vienna Circle. And this was just a huge group of psychiatrists and doctors who became enamored with Freud's ideas, and they kind of became his disciples, and they became known as the Vienna Circle, and they were the early group of folks who promoted Freud's ideas. And a lot of them later went on to become famous psychiatrists and psychologists themselves, folks like Carl Jung, for example, Erik Erikson, Anna Freud, Freud's daughter, was part of that circle. Also, I'm trying to think of the person's name. Karen Horney, who was one of the founders of a feminist approach to psychoanalysis. There were a number of notable folks who were students of Freud's who later went on to become quite famous therapists themselves. Alfred Adler was the person I was trying to think of, who also went on to become a famous therapist. So he influenced a lot of folks with this idea. But the idea behind free association, I got a little off track there, talking about the Vienna Circle, but the idea behind free association was that the person would lay down on the couch and say whatever was on their mind. And I mean whatever was on their mind, from the most minuscule thing that you would think of that you would think would have no significance. If that person was thinking about their shoelaces, that's what Freud wanted to hear about. If they were thinking about what they had for breakfast, that's what Freud wanted to hear about. If they were thinking about the fight that they had with their spouse the night before, that's what Freud wanted to hear about. True fact, Freud's middle name was Shlomo. Yep, that's true. And his original first name was actually Sigismund, but he shortened it to Sigmund. But his original full first name was Sigismund. That was his given name, but he didn't like Sigismund, so he shortened it to Sigmund. That's another little known fact about him. Yeah, but his middle name was Shlomo. um, so, which is a funny middle name. But this idea of free association was centered around the idea. It is a funny middle name. And he had some funny ideas. Freud did. I gotta admit. Although some of them I think were some powerful ideas. But the person would just talk about whatever was on their mind, from the most insignificant thought to the most significant emotional thing, just stream of consciousness. And Freud believed that eventually, over time, themes would emerge uh, in the person's ramblings. And Freud met with his clients a lot. He encouraged his clients to meet with him 3 to 5 days a week for 1 to 2 hours per session. And by the end of his career in the 1920s and 30s, Freud was charging $30 an hour to his clients. And he would meet with them, up to 8 to 10 hours a week per client, right? If you do the math and you look up the inflation rates, $30 an hour back in the 1920s or 30s, probably something like $500 an hour today. I don't know the exact number. It would be in that ballpark, I think, something like $500 an hour today, right? So we're talking an astronomical amount of money that Freud was charging his clients. And he was a celebrity by this point, so he could get away with it. And he met with them a lot. So it was very time intensive and expensive. And the result of this was that almost all of Freud's clients were wealthy aristocrats who had a lot of money and a lot of spare time on their hands. So he had a lot of clients who were princes, princesses, dukes, members of the nobility, members of royal families. Those were his clients because those were the sorts of people that could afford his services. And he charged a lot. And not just anybody could afford to spend that kind of money. And so that was free association. Just saying whatever comes to your mind. And Freud believed that themes would emerge over time that would reveal what was trying to make its way out of your subconscious. He also was a big believer in dream interpretation. He believed that dreams were the royal road to the unconscious. And he was very interested in having his clients keep a journal of their dreams and bring that journal to therapy appointments, because Freud believed that dreams really meant something. And we talked about that in that chapter when we talked about dreaming. But Freud was not one of these psychologists that believed that dreams were just random nonsense in the brain, like some psychologists believe. He believed that they were really cues to what was really bugging you. Your deepest fantasies, your deepest fears revealed themselves in your dreams. So he was a big believer in dream analysis. And in fact, his most famous book was a book called The Interpretation of Dreams. So through these two methods that he came to rely upon throughout his career, Freud aimed to uncover the unconscious conflicts and desires and fears and fantasies that were lurking in the depths of his client's unconscious. And the goal was to unearth them and expose them to the light of day. And once you expose these monsters to the light of day, they would become less scary, right? Monsters get smaller when you expose them to light, as the saying goes. So that was the idea behind it, right? Now, the problem with this is that the evidence for the efficacy of this approach to treating mental health is mixed, to put it politely, and to be a little bit more curt about it. The research evidence for Freud's approach is not flattering. There are a handful of studies that have seemed to suggest that the Freudian approach might be helpful for some people, but there's a lot of research that's been done over the years that seems to suggest that it's not so helpful, and that that's a lot of folks who go into psychoanalysis for years and years. I mean, we're talking meeting with the psychoanalyst several days a week for years and years, spending untold thousands of dollars on this, that the net result of this is not much of an improvement in the client's mental health, right? That's kind of damning news for the Freudian approach. Although I do think there is some value, and this is just my personal opinion, by the way, I do think there is some value to the idea, and I've said this before, that some people have things about themselves that they are refusing to face, and they would be better off if they face those things that they're not wanting to face. I think that applies to some people. I don't think it's the cause of all mental illnesses, though, like Freud did, right? So Freud kind of thought this was the cause of all mental illnesses. I think for many people, it is the root of much mental distress, but I don't think it's a blanket generality that applies to everyone. But I can think of folks, for example, like folks who are in an active addiction, maybe a drug addiction or alcoholism or something like that. One of the hallmark symptoms of folks who are actively addicted is that they're refusing to face up to the fact that they're addicted, right? I don't have a problem. What we would call the classic Freudian defense mechanism of denial, right? So I think there is something, I think there is something useful in the idea of defense mechanisms, and I think there's something useful about the idea of getting people to face the things about themselves that they don't want to face. And to me, ultimately, that is the big take home that I take from Freud's decades of work with his clients. There's a lot of quackery in there, but I think the big take home that we can all take from Freud is know yourself and quit BSing yourself about those things that you're BSing yourself about, and you will be a stronger, better person as a result of it. That's my ultimate take home with Freud. Just my opinion, but I think there's some value to that idea. So we have a lot of material to cover today in a short period of time, so we don't have a lot of time for discussion, but I will open it up for comments at a couple of points. You guys have any final thoughts or comments about Freud? That's the last time you guys are going to hear about him from me in this class. So any closing thoughts about Freud? Okay, so the next approach to psychotherapy, which kind of came along as a reaction against Freud in some sense, is the humanistic approach. I've touched on this already in past lectures. These are theoretical approaches that we've already seen in previous chapters. We're just looking at the way they approach psychotherapy now, right? So the humanists, as I've talked about before, had a much brighter view of human nature than Freud did. Freud believed that ultimately, as I've said before, that we're all just bloodthirsty animals, dressed up like civilized people. He had this really negative, pessimistic view of human nature, which is another reason why a lot of folks don't like Freud. I actually think there's some truth to that view of human nature. I hate to be a pessimist, but I think there's at least some degree of truth to it. Maybe it's not all there is to us, but I think there's some truth to it. But Freud had this very negative, pessimistic view of human nature, and the humanists had more of this feel-good view of human nature. They were kind of the bright side of psychology, right? And they believed that human beings have this innate goodness within them that is looking to be actualized. That's the term self-actualization that you'll hear about from humanistic psychology, which we looked at in the chapter on motivation, which was Abraham Maslow's idea, which was the top of his hierarchy of needs that we looked at. So Maslow was the major humanistic psychologist who influenced motivation theory. The other major humanistic psychologist was Carl Rogers, and Carl Rogers' contributions were mainly within the domain of personality theory and psychotherapy. So Rogers believed that in order for a client-therapist relationship to be helpful, that the client needed to feel completely free and open to talk about anything to their therapist. They needed to feel like they would never be judged. They needed to feel like the therapist would always hold them in a condition of what Rogers referred to as unconditional positive regard. Rogers also talked about this in the domain of parenting too, as we saw in the chapter on personality a couple chapters ago. But this idea of unconditional positive regard was kind of central to Carl Rogers' thinking. And he believed that in order for a psychotherapeutic relationship to be helpful to a client, that client had to feel 100% accepted and non-judged by their therapist. And I've talked about this before in the past, how this is easier said than done. Clients will often share some really dark stuff with their therapist, and I mean dark, all right? The darkest parts of our humanity, they oftentimes, clients feel like their therapist is the only person that they can share these things with. Things that they don't even share with their spouses or with their parents or with their siblings. The only person in the world who might know about this thing about a person might be their therapist, right? So Rogers believed that it was critically important that clients felt free to share literally anything, and that any degree of perceived judgment or condescension from the therapist would be met with the client by emotionally shutting down, and that would disable the therapeutic relationship. So complete, total acceptance was a kind of a linchpin of Carl Rogers' approach. And another aspect of Carl Rogers' approach was that he was really big on active listening, which was a little different than Freud, because Freud, in the way he trained his therapists, they would pretty much just not say much at all during a therapy session other than, interesting, tell me more, right? That's kind of the stereotypical Freudian responses during psychoanalysis. But a humanistic therapist trained in the Rogerian client-centered tradition, they're going to echo back the things you say to them. Like, so what I'm hearing you say is that you're experiencing some emotional difficulties having to do with stressors on the job and with your marriage at home, and you're having difficulty finding a balance between your job and your home life, right? So echoing back what the client has just said to you in your own paraphrased words to ensure that you have a correct understanding of what the client has said. So sometimes you see this stereotype in movies of therapists just repeating back to their client what they just said, right? That is sort of a caricature of the Rogerian humanistic approach. And it's based to some degree on the truth. There is a lot of parroting and echoing back that you will see in a Rogerian therapy session, which is humanistic. Rogerian referring to Carl Rogers. And another thing that I don't have on this slide, but that I should have on this slide, it was just an oversight on my part, is that Rogerian humanistic therapy is very non-directive, because remember, the humanistic psychologists believe that every human being has within them their own innate wisdom that's just looking to find its way out, right? Which is kind of an airy-fairy kind of, I think, maybe overly optimistic estimation of a lot of human beings. But that's what the humanistic psychologists believed, and it's probably true for most of us. I don't think it's completely untrue, but I think there are just some people who just don't have any sense. But I digress. But the humanists believe that every person has within them the answers to their problems, and that those answers can't be given to them from the outside. So the Rogerian therapist was trained to just be a sounding board and to basically engage the client in a Socratic dialogue that would lead the client into discovering the solution that they just haven't become consciously aware of yet, that they've always had within them, but they just haven't actualized, to use a humanistic term. So the idea is that the client needs to feel like whatever solution they come to, like let's say you're a Rogerian therapist and you've got a client who's trying to make a decision about whether or not to break up with someone, right? And they're trying to weigh the pros and cons of, this is why I should stay with this person, this is why I should break up with this person. That the client should come to that decision on their own. So Rogerian therapists are very hesitant to ever give advice or to tell their client what to do. And this can be frustrating for some clients because they feel like they're paying the therapist to be the expert and to tell them what to do, right? So some folks don't do well with this approach because they really want to have a therapist that's going to tell them what to do. However, the Rogerian approach says that that's the wrong way to do it, that whatever decision is come to by the client needs to feel like they came to it themselves. So the therapist is just a guide to try to get you to discover what your own answer to your problem is, right? The only exception to that would be, say, if you have a client who expresses that they're suicidal, then at that point, the therapist would become directive and would actively take measures to discourage the individual from taking their own life, and even institutionalizing them if need be to prevent it. But with that exception, in most cases, 90% of the time, loud motorcycle, sorry, 90% of the time, in most cases, the client is going to come to their own solution, right? And the therapist is not going to tell them what to do. So that's the humanistic Rogerian approach in a nutshell. And that has been pretty influential, by the way. And this idea of unconditional positive regard has actually influenced a lot of therapists. And even if you go to a therapist who isn't a pure humanist, a pure Rogerian, most therapists these days are at least influenced to some degree by Carl Rogers' ideas, even if they're not a pure Rogerian. The same could be said of Freud, by the way, too. Most therapists are still influenced by Freud, even if they're not a proper Freudian. There aren't a lot of pure Freudian therapists left in the world, but most therapists have been influenced by Freud, at least to a tiny degree. And that's probably also true of Carl Rogers as well. All right, so the next type of, we're going to start to get into more modern approaches to therapy here, more recent approaches to therapy that are more currently in use, right? So there aren't as many pure psychoanalysts or pure Rogerians these days as there used to be. There are still some in the world, but you see a lot more behavior therapists and a lot more cognitive therapists and cognitive behavioral therapists. So that's what we're going to talk about now. Okay, so behavior therapy is a brand of psychotherapy that aims to change people's behavior, hence behavior therapy. It's a broad catch-all term that includes a number of methodologies. But what all behavior therapies have in common is that the goal is to change a behavior pattern. Specifically, stop doing that, or start doing this, or stop doing that and replace it with this, right? So the goal is to change behavior, a clearly defined behavior pattern. So that's what behavior therapies have in common. And it can be used in a number of arenas. So for example, one common form of behavior therapy is used to treat anxiety disorders, which is known as exposure therapy. It's also sometimes referred to as flooding. But with exposure therapy, you have a type of behavior therapy where the person is exposed to whatever it is that they have a phobia of, or whatever it is that they have anxiety about. It could be used to treat phobias. It could be used to treat OCD, also PTSD. But the idea is that you expose the person to the thing that they're afraid of, and they learn to not be afraid of that thing anymore. Another form of this is what's known as systematic desensitization, which is another form of exposure therapy, but it's a little bit different from flooding. So there are basically two types of exposure therapies. They're both exposure therapies or behavioral therapies, but there are two subtypes of exposure therapy. You have flooding, which is kind of just abruptly exposing to the person to what it is they're afraid of and to just kind of get it over with, right? It's the more abrupt, more traumatic way of doing it. Systematic desensitization is the more gradual approach to exposure therapy, where you gradually expose the person to whatever it is that they're afraid of. So let's say, for example, if the person is afraid of flying, you work them up to the point where they're ready to actually ride in an airplane, but you would start with maybe getting them relaxed and having them just imagine an airplane flying through the sky, right? And then in the next session, you would get them relaxed and just have them imagine riding in an airplane, right? And then the next step, you just gradually step it up until they finally graduate to actually going for a real airplane ride and overcoming that phobia or that fear. So systematic desensitization is a more gradual approach to exposure therapy. Another form of behavior therapy is pretty popular right now, It's called applied behavior analysis, which is actually a form of behavior therapy that my wife she's doing her master's degree in applied behavior analysis right now. And applied behavior analysis is most well known for being a form of behavior therapy that is often used to treat children who have behavioral disorders, often children on the autism spectrum or children with Down syndrome, children with various developmental disorders. Applied behavior analysis is commonly used to treat those children's behavior problems that often go along with those disorders. That's what it's most well known for, although I have to say that there are other applications of ABA outside of treating childhood behavioral problems. It's most well known for that, but there's another form of it called OBM, Organizational Behavior Management, where ABA is used in organizations to make people more cooperative within companies and organizations and that sort of thing. Sort of an industrial psychology application of ABA. But what ABA is most well known for is the treatment of autism spectrum disorders, particularly those behavior problems. So there are a number of different behavior therapies, but what they all have in common is that they aim to change people's behavior. There are also behavioral treatments for depression, by the way. There are all sorts of behavior therapies. And these treatments can be extremely effective. For example, applied behavior analysis is really well supported by the research. So is systematic desensitization for treatment of anxiety disorders. Some of the best treatments that we have for behavioral problems and anxiety disorders in particular come from a behavioral approach. And the methods that they utilize come out of chapter 6, like classical conditioning, reinforcement, punishment, modeling. All of these different types of learning that we talked about in chapter 6 are the types of methods that behavior analysts and behavior therapists use to change people's behavior patterns. And that's very much still in use today. And a lot of people go into behavior therapy. It's one of the hot areas these days within treatment. The other major hot area within mental health treatment are cognitive therapies. So cognitive therapy is a brand of psychotherapy that aims to get people to think more rationally. It actually has historical roots in the philosophy of Stoicism. And a lot of people aren't aware of this, but Stoicism is a philosophical system that came out of ancient Greece initially, and then also Rome. And there have been a number of notable Stoic philosophers over the years. But the basic idea behind Stoicism as a philosophy is that people are overly dominated by their emotions. And that if we could learn to get more rational control over our emotional processes and our emotional reactions and behave more rationally in the world, we would all be better off for it, right? So this is kind of the ancient philosophical roots of cognitive therapy. But modern cognitive therapy as a psychotherapy is aimed at getting people to think more rationally and more realistically about things. And the two major folks that you will see who were kind of credited as being the founders of cognitive therapy were Aaron Beck and Albert Ellis. And each of them kind of had their own brand of cognitive therapy. But whether you're talking about Aaron Beck's cognitive restructuring technique or Albert Ellis's rational emotive therapy, what they both have in common is that these therapies are aiming to get people to think more rationally about the events that happen in their life. Because if you look at folks who suffer from depression and anxiety disorders, for example, which are the two most common types of mental illness, depression and anxiety disorders, what both of those types of disorders have in common is that often individuals who suffer from those mental illnesses engage in a lot of unrealistically, irrationally negative thinking patterns, right? And this isn't about just getting people to think more positively, right? I think that's kind of a misnomer about cognitive therapy that a lot of people have as a misunderstanding. It's not just, ooh, the power of positive thinking. Everybody likes me, right? No, it's not about that kind of bullshit, right? It's about getting people to think more rationally and more realistically. and to be less inclined towards reasoning with their emotions, what cognitive therapists refer to as emotional reasoning. So folks who folks who have a tendency towards depression and anxiety have a tendency to think in irrationally negative ways. So let's give a concrete example of how this often plays out in a person who has an anxiety disorder or depression or both. Oftentimes they're comorbid. Okay, so let's say that you are a person suffering from an anxiety disorder or let's say depression, right? So you're parking your car in the parking lot in the morning on your way into work. And as you park your car in the parking lot, you get out of your car and your boss pulls in and parks a couple spaces over from you. Your boss gets out of her car as you're getting out of yours, and in a very friendly fashion, you say, "Good morning," right? And let's say your boss is rude to you in some way. Either your boss yells at you, or your boss doesn't answer you, or gives you a very short, curt response that is not a friendly response. Your boss is unfriendly. Your boss is rude in response to your friendly good morning greeting, right? Well, how would most of us, if we were thinking rationally and we weren't depressed or anxious, react to such an event? We might say something like, "Oh, I guess somebody woke up on the wrong side of the bed," or, "What the hell is her problem today?" Right? Or, "Well, so someone must have, gotten into a fight with their husband this morning," right? Or, maybe any number of explanations that could explain why your boss is in a bad mood that morning and why your boss is being rude, right? So a rational reaction to that would be, "Wow, she's having a rough morning. I wonder what's, I wonder what's eating her up this morning, right? What's behind this?" And that would be a rational response, because we're assuming that this is an out of character response. Your boss usually doesn't behave this way. So clearly something's bothering her today, right? And we probably wouldn't take it terribly personally. And, oh, they're just having a bad day. Or let's say maybe you did screw up on the job the day before or something. And maybe you've actually done something that merits a reprimand, right? And maybe there's some concrete reason why your boss is actually pissed off at you. Still, we can still be rational about that, right? We can say, "Look, darling," I'm just making the boss's name up right now. "Look, darling, I'm really sorry I screwed up yesterday. I can do better than that. And I welcome your guidance on how I could improve. And, I'm not going to let that happen again. It was a mistake and I've learned from it. And can we move on? I'll do better next time." Right? And then you move on, right? That would be a rational way of reacting to the situation if your boss was actually angry with you personally about something that you'd screwed up on, right? So whether your boss is angry at you personally or whether she's just having a bad morning, either way, there's a rational way to react to that, right? But instead of reacting in a rational way, a person who is depressed or anxious is going to have a tendency to really, really internalize that, right? So it's, "Oh my God, I'm a terrible employee. I'm totally worthless. I'm probably about to get fired. Next thing I know, I'm going to be divorced. My wife's going to leave me because I've lost my job. And, we're going to foreclose on the house. I'm going to end up homeless in a ditch covered in flies," right? All because your boss was rude to you that morning. Your brain automatically goes to this extreme sort of scenario where it's the end of the world. And that's what cognitive therapists refer to as catastrophizing, right? You're turning you're making a mountain out of a molehill, right? You're making it into much more than it actually is. So folks who have this tendency towards depression and anxiety have a tendency to think in this way. And there's a lot of research to back up this assertion. So one of the most prevalent therapies these days for depression and anxiety disorders is cognitive therapy, which as we've seen involves getting people to think more rationally about the things that happen in their life. The most cutting edge type of psychotherapy these days, I would argue, would be cognitive behavioral therapy, which, as you might have guessed, combines behavior therapy approaches with cognitive therapy. So you combine those two approaches, and the best evidence suggests that cognitive therapy is the most effective treatment that we have in terms of psychotherapy. It's the most effective psychotherapy treatment that we have for depression and anxiety disorders. And the most common types of mental illnesses are depression and anxiety disorders. So if you have a depression issue or an anxiety issue and you are interested in going into therapy over it, you would be best served to see a therapist who is trained in the cognitive behavioral treatment approaches to depression and anxiety. And that's going to be your best bet. And another cool thing about cognitive behavior therapy is that you don't have to see the therapist forever, right? Like you might have with a Freudian therapist or a humanistic therapist. Usually with cognitive behavioral therapy, if you're dealing with a specific depression or an anxiety issue, you might be done in 8 to 10 sessions, and you've been trained in how to use these approaches, and you don't have to see the therapist for the rest of your life because now you know what to do. You know how to implement these strategies in your own life, so you don't have to see the therapist forever, right? A good therapist will make you not need them anymore, right? So that's an important thing to think about. So insurance companies love CBT because there's a lot of research evidence behind its effectiveness, and oftentimes you can accomplish your therapeutic goals in a limited number of sessions, maybe 8 to 10 sessions, something like that. And again, there's a lot of research evidence to support the use of CBT for depression and anxiety disorders. So perhaps the biggest obstacle to people getting quality psychotherapy is the cost of therapy. A lot of folks don't have health insurance, and even if you do have health insurance, a lot of health plans will only cover a very limited number of sessions. So I'm very fortunate in the fact that I have a really good insurance plan through the college. They take really good care of us in terms of health insurance. In fact, you could argue that the health insurance benefits are even a better perk than the actual salary. In fact, a lot of folks go into teaching not for the salary, but for the benefits, right? And we get pretty good health insurance, I got to say. I'm pretty thankful for that. And the mental health coverage on our health insurance plan is really good. But a lot of insurance plans will not pay for very many sessions. And a lot of folks don't even have health insurance, right? Obamacare, although well-intentioned, I think, I say this in a nonpartisan way. I'm not expressing an allegiance to the Democrat or Republican Party when I say this. Obamacare was a disaster. All right, that's just my opinion, but I think the evidence bears that out. And even with Obamacare, health insurance has not become terribly affordable or good for a lot of people. And in fact, a lot of people's insurance rates actually went up after Obamacare was instituted, which was the exact opposite of what the Affordable Care Act was intended. But political rant aside, a lot of people don't have decent health insurance. And a lot of people can't afford psychotherapy because we're talking $100 to $200 an hour for a decent therapist these days. If you're paying out of pocket for a psychotherapist, if you're paying somebody who has a master's degree, you're probably going to pay them about $100 an hour. If you're paying someone who has a doctoral degree, a PhD or an MD, you're probably going to pay them anywhere from $200 to $250 an hour, right? And if you're paying out of pocket, that can be really cost prohibitive. So the solution to this for a lot of folks is group therapy. Group therapy is a lot more affordable, and you might pay $20, $30 for a session for group therapy as opposed to $100 to $200 a session for one-on-one psychotherapy. So in group therapy, you have multiple individuals who are in a room with the therapist at once, and they're doing psychotherapy as a group. Usually it's on a theme, right? So there's group therapy geared towards anger management. There's group therapy for PTSD. If I remember correctly, I played a video actually of some veterans undergoing group therapy for PTSD in a previous class meeting. And it's a lot more affordable, and it can be beneficial. The downside, of course, is that you get less one-on-one attention from your therapist because there are multiple clients there in the room, anywhere from 5 to 10 clients, depending on the nature of the group therapy. So that the upside is cost, the downside is you get less individualized attention from the therapist. I think it's also important that we distinguish group therapy from support groups. So a support group is something like Alcoholics Anonymous, where the group is being run by somebody who struggles with whatever problem it is that that group is targeting, right? So in Alcoholics Anonymous, the group is run by a recovered alcoholic who has some sober time, right? I think the requirement is you have to be sober for at least a year or something like that before you can run a meeting of AA. So that's an example of a support group. It's a group of people, of lay people who have gotten together to share their experience and social support with each other in dealing with a particular issue, whether it be addiction or PTSD. But the key thing is that support groups are run by lay people. Group therapy meetings are run by licensed therapists. So that's the key difference between group therapy and support groups. And support groups can be incredibly useful, by the way. I'm not denigrating them. It's just that by definition, they are run by lay people. That doesn't make them useless. It just means that the person running the meeting is not a licensed mental health professional. Okay. The last type of therapy that I want to talk about before we jump in to psychiatry for what little time we have left of the class meeting is family therapy. So a lot of mental health and emotional issues are better targeted if the whole family is involved. Going back to the example of addiction, there's a show, Intervention, that some of you guys may have seen. I think it's streaming on Netflix or something now, or Roku, I can't remember. But it used to be on TV, maybe it still is, but it's about families who are trying to figure out how to deal with a family member who has an addiction and it's just wrecking the family, right? Addiction is a prime example of a mental illness that affects the whole family. So a family therapy approach to that would be to get the entire family together, or at least the household, and to strategize about how everybody can be on the same page and helping that person get into recovery, right? Another example of family therapy would be couples counseling, where maybe a couple is going through some hiccups in their relationship, and they're trying to figure out how to work through their issues, right? And a lot of the time it involves increasing communication skills and just teaching each member of the dyad how they can better communicate their needs with each other. Now, in some cases, couples counseling might actually result in the couple discovering that they're incompatible. And in that case, instead of the couples counseling being about how they can resolve their differences, the focus then becomes, well, how can we break up in an amicable way and remain friends afterwards, right? Or maybe there's children involved, right? And a lot of divorces where there's children involved can get really, really nasty, right? So a family therapy approach might be not to actually try to save the marriage if the couple has already decided that they're going to divorce, but how can we go about this divorce in a way so that we're not enemies with each other afterwards, so that we can still co-parent our children together and that we can still get along with each other and not traumatize our kids as part of the process, right? So that would be another example of family therapy. So there are numerous examples of this, of a family therapy approach. So that was a really quick crash course and different approaches to psychotherapy. I just want to reiterate that I did not come anywhere near talking about all of the possible ways psychotherapy could be approached, but I did talk about the most influential schools of thought in psychotherapy that have played a role historically in shaping the history of the field of psychotherapy. Just for the sake of time, we can't go into much further depth and detail than that, because next we need to talk about, at least for a few minutes, the field of psychiatry, which is the domain of psychotropic medications. So psychiatrists are folks who prescribe psychotropic medications. Also, family practice physicians, if you go to your regular doctor, for a checkup, it's not uncommon to hear about family practice, also known as GPs, general practitioners. It's not uncommon to hear about GPs prescribing antidepressants to some degree, and they can do that. Although if you have a heavy-duty mental illness like bipolar disorder or schizophrenia, you probably at that point want to enlist the help of a psychiatrist, because at that point, your family practice physician is probably not going to be sufficiently specialized in mental health to be able to help you with that. So at that point, you're getting into the domain of getting the help of a psychiatrist. But broadly speaking, any sort of pharmaceutical or any sort of pharmaceutical approach to treating mental illness is what we refer to as the domain of psychotropic medications. So these medications work by changing the chemistry of the brain. So let's take a quick look at the different classes of psychotropic medications. First, we'll look at anti-anxiety drugs. This is pretty self-explanatory as to what they do. These are drugs that are designed to treat panic attacks in particular. And the major class of drugs that treat anxiety are drugs called benzodiazepines. And these include drugs like Valium, Xanax, and Ativan, all right? These are really potent sedatives. They're classified as minor tranquilizers, but these are sedatives that will quickly alleviate the symptoms of a panic attack, and they're extremely effective at doing so. I have one experience with them that I can share. So I went in for a surgery once, which I won't go into detail on the TMI of the surgery, but I went in for a surgery which involved staying awake during the surgery. In other words, the doctor gave me a local anesthetic, all right? But I wasn't put under. There was no general anesthesia. They just numbed the area where I was opened up, and I was kept awake during the surgery. So I'm sitting here wide awake while my doctor is opening me up, right? And before the surgery began, the doctor gave me the option of giving me some Valium, because he said that a lot of folks get really bad anxiety during this surgery when they're awake for it. So would you like some Valium in addition to the local anesthetic to help alleviate the anxiety? And I said, yes, please. So I got to tell you that was my one experience with benzodiazepine drugs, and that Valium, he gave me 3 of them, and I had never even taken it before, so it was a hefty dose. He gave me 3 Valium pills, and I went to Happy Land. I mean, it was, I cannot describe the feeling of peace and well-being that came as a result of being on the Valium, and the effect lasted for about 5 hours. And I had to have a family member give me a ride home from the surgery. You can't drive on Valium. But very potent. And I remember saying to myself when I was on that Valium, I can see why people get addicted to this stuff, right? So the benzodiazepine drugs are really effective, and they work fast, and they don't just get rid of your anxiety, they make you feel really good, right? So they're highly habit forming. And that's the problem with the benzodiazepines, is that they're highly addictive. And a lot of people develop addictions to them, and they develop a tolerance so that they need to take more and more of the drug to get the same effect, right? And it starts to get dangerous. People start to overdose. Death can occur. Extremely habit forming. So the problem with the pharmaceutical approach to treating anxiety, at least with the benzodiazepines, is that you need more and more of the drug. You develop a tolerance, you habituate, and you can develop a substance abuse addiction really easily, kind of similar to the way people develop opioid addictions when they're treating pain, right? with drugs like fentanyl and oxycodone. So habit forming. So as an alternative, sometimes antidepressant drugs like Prozac are used to treat anxiety disorders. An interesting thing about Prozac and the SSRI drugs is that they're not just effective for treating depression, but they can also sometimes alleviate anxiety, and more safely than you can with something like Valium or Xanax. So a lot of folks with anxiety disorders end up with a Prozac prescription because in addition to treating depression, these drugs also seem to treat anxiety. And again, there's this weird overlap between anxiety and depression. They're often comorbid. But the way antidepressant drugs work is they improve your mood by increasing serotonin levels in your brain. For the most part, most antidepressants work this way. There are a class of antidepressants called atypical antidepressants that aren't listed on this slide. And those antidepressants work on other neurotransmitters other than serotonin, neurotransmitters like dopamine, for example, which you see with Wellbutrin, or neurotransmitters like norepinephrine, like you see with Effexor. But overwhelmingly, most of your antidepressant drugs work by increasing serotonin levels in the brain. Your mood stabilizer drugs are drugs that are designed to treat manic episodes. So these are drugs that you treat bipolar disorder with. And the go-to mood stabilizer for treating mania is a drug called lithium. And lithium is extremely effective at treating mania. And it is the go-to treatment, like I said, for treating bipolar disorder. However, a lot of folks can't tolerate lithium because it has certain side effects, and it can cause liver toxicity. It can affect your kidneys in a negative way. So there are a sizable number of folks who cannot tolerate the side effects of lithium and the toxicity that it causes in the body. So as an alternative to lithium, sometimes antipsychotic drugs are used to treat manic episodes. So that brings us to the next category. Your antipsychotic drugs are drugs that are used to treat the positive symptoms of schizophrenia, like your hallucinations, your delusions. And these drugs were a godsend when they were invented, because prior to the invention of the first antipsychotics, which were Thorazine and Halidol, the only treatment that existed for schizophrenia was lobotomy. And for those of you who aren't familiar with lobotomy, lobotomy involved the surgical removal of the bottom front part of the brain, the orbitofrontal cortex. And the way it was done, it was quite barbaric. The surgeon would go in with a sterilized ice pick. Yes, you heard me correctly, an ice pick. Would go in with a sterilized ice pick and take the ice pick around, would go in through the side of your eye, go in behind your eye with the ice pick, scrape around a little bit, and scrape off the front part of your brain. And that was how they used to treat schizophrenia. And by the way, it worked. Folks who received lobotomies became very docile and cooperative after their lobotomies. Of course, the downside to it was that it basically made them mentally retarded, because you just scraped off the front part of the brain, which is the most intelligent, rational part of the brain. So profound deficits in intellectual functioning after the procedure, you basically turn the person into someone who's intellectually disabled for the rest of their life. And also extremely barbaric procedure, right? You know, you're scraping off the front part of a person's brain while they're wide awake with an ice pick. I can't think of a more horrific, barbaric sort of procedure to go through, right? So when the antipsychotics were invented, they were a godsend because they almost overnight caused lobotomies to stop. Due to the existence of Thorazine and Halidol, lobotomies became all but non-existent, and there hardly anybody in the world ever does them anymore. I think there might be 2 or 3 lobotomies done in the world per year now, right, in the world, as opposed to the thousands that used to be done to patients with schizophrenia every year. So it basically eliminated lobotomy as a result of the existence of these antipsychotics. But the first generation antipsychotics really had some nasty side effects, like Thorazine, for example, and Halidol. Besides the point that they were extremely sedating, basically, if you were on these drugs, you would not be able to operate heavy machinery or do anything that was in any way mentally demanding to any degree. So they were extremely sedating. But besides that, they had some nasty long-term side effects, particularly an irreversible neurological disease known as tardive dyskinesia, which was a long-term side effect of Thorazine and Halidal. So once you get tardive dyskinesia, it never goes away, and it's a neurological disorder characterized by uncontrollable smacking of your lips. Just imagine doing that all day uncontrollably, right? So, and also tics and seizures, right? Terrible side effects of long-term use. So thankfully, a second generation of antipsychotics came to be in the last few decades, and these are what are known as the atypical antipsychotics. And these are drugs like Seroquel and Zyprexa, for example, that don't have quite as bad of the side effects that you see with Thorazine and Halidal, although they do have some pretty nasty side effects of their own, like you see listed in the slide. So the problem that we've seen historically with bipolar disorder and schizophrenia is that oftentimes there's an issue with treatment compliance because these folks will want to stop taking their medications because of their extremely nasty side effects. And who could blame them, right? Because those are really nasty side effects that you often see with drugs like lithium and with the antipsychotics. And even the newer antipsychotics, even though they don't cause tardive dyskinesia, they have some other nasty side effects that you can see listed in the slide. So treatment compliance is a major issue. And that's why historically so many folks with bipolar disorder and schizophrenia have trouble staying on their meds, not to mention the fact that they're expensive. So multiple reasons for medication compliance issues. The last class of drugs that I want to briefly talk about are the stimulants. These are the drugs that we use to treat attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. These are significant central nervous system stimulants. Adderall is the newer one. The older generation one was a stimulant called Ritalin. My dad actually took Ritalin when he was a kid. These are hardcore stimulants. And Adderall is actually just the brand name for amphetamine, all right? So Adderall is amphetamine, plain and simple. Methamphetamine is basically just Adderall that someone's trying to make in their basement, right? So the difference between meth and Adderall is that Adderall is chemically pure. You're getting it from the pharmacy without all the contaminants in it. Meth is basically a person's attempt to create Adderall out of household cleaners, right? So when you take meth, you're getting all of these chemical impurities that cause your teeth to rot out and cause brain damage and all of this other stuff. So really the only difference between methamphetamine and Adderall is that Adderall is chemically pure. So that's something that a lot of people don't know. And I'm not condemning these drugs, by the way. A lot of people with ADHD need them in order to function. The problem is that, though, a lot of people abuse them. And if you want to see a really interesting film about this, there's a documentary on Netflix called Take Your Pills. In fact, if you haven't done the psychology and film extra credit opportunity, I would actually recommend that as an option. Take Your Pills. It's on Netflix, and it's a documentary about the history of Adderall and Ritalin and controversies surrounding their use and misuse. So that's worth checking out if you haven't done that extra credit opportunity, which is still open. And I'll keep it open until the day the semester ends. So those are the classes of psychotropic medications. Those are the types of drugs that psychiatrists prescribe. There are a lot of alternative treatments to mental illness worth mentioning. I'm only going to have time to talk about one of them. It's the most well-known one, electroshock therapy, also known as electroconvulsive therapy. It has kind of a bad rap because of movies like One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest and other Hollywood films that have, kind of portrayed electroconvulsive therapy in a really negative light. But I have to say that it's a last line of treatment for folks with treatment-resistant depression. So if you're suicidally depressed and antidepressants aren't working, cognitive behavioral therapy isn't working, kind of the last resort treatment for severe depression is electroconvulsive therapy. And it's done in a lot more humane of a way than you typically see in the movies, right? So when it's done in real life, the person is put into restraints because it's going to cause convulsions. It's basically a controlled seizure that they're inducing. You're put into restraints. There's nobody holding you down like it's not like a team of 6 people holding you down like you see in the movies. You're put into restraints and you're given an anti-seizure medication to reduce the severity of the convulsions. A drug like Tegretol or Depakote, for example, that will reduce the severity of the convulsions. You're given a mouth guard, a mouthpiece, so when you bite down, that you don't cause any damage to your teeth, and you're delivered the electroshocks. And it's extremely effective, actually. It has saved the lives of a lot of folks who are suicidally depressed. James Barrett said, Return to Oz had a super creepy electroshock therapy for a kid's movie. Ooh, I didn't know that. I'll have to check that out. Yeah, Hollywood has done a really good job of villainizing electroconvulsive therapy. But when it's done in real life, it's a lot less dramatic, I promise. And you're given anti-convulsive medications, you're put in restraints, you're given a mouth guard, and it's not quite as dramatic as you see in the movies. And it's extremely effective. There are folks who have been brought back from the brink of suicide through the result of this treatment. The crazy thing about it, though, is we really don't know how it works. Like with antidepressants, we know that we're increasing serotonin levels in the brain or dopamine levels in the brain. But with electroconvulsive therapy, we really don't know why it works. It's kind of like, it's like if you have a washing machine that's making a knocking sound and you go and give it a good tap, right? We call it a technical tap, right? You should give it a good tap and it stops making that sound. That's kind of like what ECT is for the brain, right? It's like, hey, stop that, boom, and the electroshock is kind of the psychiatric equivalent of giving the brain a technical tap. We don't know why it works, but it does. One theory is that maybe it just resets the brain in some way to its default settings. I don't know, but yeah, so it's effective. And the major side effect, though, is that it causes memory loss. So it does have that side effect of temporary memory loss. So oftentimes, if you get electroshock therapy or electroconvulsive therapy, as it's called, oftentimes people don't actually remember getting the therapy itself, but they experience the effects of the therapy afterwards. But it's almost like an alcoholic blackout that you experience during the period of time that you're actually receiving the electric shocks. It's kind of eerie, but it works. So yeah, interesting method. Okay, so the last few slides here, we only have 3 minutes left, so I'm just going to kind of mention them and direct you guys to them, and in hopes that you guys will study this stuff on your own in the chapter. The last few slides deal with choosing a treatment provider, okay? So there are 2 last slides here. The second to last slide is a list of the different types of mental health treatment providers. I've touched on this when I talked about the distinction between psychiatrists and psychologists, but I want you guys to look more fully at this slide, familiarize yourself with this information. I probably will have a question or 2 on the exam that draws from information in this table. These are the different types of professionals that provide mental health services and the level of training required to work as a professional in that designation, okay? So familiarize yourself with that. The last slide that I have that I want you guys to familiarize yourself with on your own, because we just ran out of time, is this is an evidence-based treatment slide, okay? So what we have here are a list of therapies that the evidence seems to suggest, based on solid research, that are most effective at treating different mental illnesses, all right? So take a look at this slide and definitely read the chapter for sure, because I originally had planned to spend 2 days on this chapter. I just got bogged down in chapter 14. So that's it. I am working on the final, like I said, I'll have a study guide up. It will be open book, open note, but there will be a pretty strict time limit on it as well. So still study, because if you try to look up the answer to every single question, you're going to run out of time on the exam. So if you haven't signed in today, please do so. And again, I want to reiterate for those who signed in late, It has been an honor and a privilege to be your instructor. I love what I do, and I love having discussions with students in class. And I think we've made it work, even though we've had some significant changes that we've had to deal with due to the pandemic. And hopefully we get a vaccine here pretty soon. I hear there's some promising research happening on that front. I'm looking forward to being back in a real classroom myself, but I know this summer we're going to continue to use Zoom. And speaking of which, I know a few of you guys, I've been looking at my rosters. I happen to know that a handful of you guys are signed up to take some classes with me this summer. So I look forward to seeing you again. And if you are interested and you haven't yet signed up, just to reiterate, I am teaching Introduction to Sociology and Human Growth and Development this summer. And those are going to be courses that are delivered via Zoom. Those courses start in June. So if you like the way I do things, come see me again this summer. If I don't see you again, it's been a pleasure. I wish you the best in life. And I hope that you've learned some things in this course that you find useful, if not useful, at least interesting. Okay, so thank you, Porcelain, and I appreciate all of you guys. In case you're wondering about course evaluations, the college canceled course evaluations this semester because of the coronavirus outbreak. They saw fit to do that. So if you feel passionate about sharing your assessment of me as an instructor, positive or negative, it's your right to do so. You are welcome to go on ratemyprofessor.com and give me a rating. I'm not pressuring you to do that, but if you want to do that, you can, and it is your right to do so. So maybe come see me this summer. Yep, it's been my pleasure, Kaylee, and I appreciate all you guys. I will be available next week. I'm going to be doing a lot of grading, but if anybody wants to have a Zoom conference with me to talk about your grade, or if you're just bored and you need somebody to talk to, I know that applies to a lot of folks who are kind of stuck in their homes. So, just shoot me an email. We can have a Zoom meeting, if you just need to talk, either about the course or whatever. So, all right, take care, guys, and keep an eye out for an email with further information about your final. Keep an eye out for your essay grades. Keep an eye out for grades on the extra credit opportunities. If you have not done the extra credit opportunities, you still have time to do that. And for those of you who are on my rosters for this summer, I will see you guys in a couple of months. And take care. I'm going to get busy grading this afternoon. I've got a mountain of things to grade. So if you don't see grades showing up today, I am going to be working on them over the next week. I appreciate everyone's patience. It takes time, more time than you realize to grade papers. So,
Mr. Carr.
Yeah.
So I was under the impression that this exam 3 study guide was the study guide for the final, and that is not correct. You have not posted a study guide for the final yet?
Correct. Yeah, and I apologize for getting behind on that. I will have that. It is my priority to have the study guide posted this afternoon, and the exam itself will be open tomorrow, and it will be open through the middle of next week. So you guys will have from Friday to, I want to say, Tuesday, Wednesday at the latest to get the final done. So I meant to have the study guide up sooner, but it is the first thing on my to-do list this afternoon is to get the study guides posted for my classes. So I will commit to having the study guide up for you guys today.
Is that a cumulative?
No, chapters 12 through 15.
Oh, okay.
Yep. So.
All right. So how about this exam 4 that's due to, wait. There's something.
That's the final.
There's something that's due tonight.
Oh, is that the quiz? Let's take a look here. I think you guys have the last quiz due tonight, and I kind of forgot.
Quiz 5 is due tonight.
Yeah, quiz 5 is due tonight, and it will contain some items that will reappear on the final, also, as an FYI. Yep.
All right. So you say 12 through 15, right?
12 through 15, yes. Social psychology, personality theory, mental illnesses, and mental health treatment.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
And I'll have that study guide posted this afternoon. And I do have that last quiz set to be due tonight. If you don't get it done today, it's not the end of the world, but please do get it done before the end of the course, preferably before the end of the final, so at least you can use it as a study tool to prepare for the final, because like I said, I tend to reuse some quiz questions on final exams. So definitely prioritize that 5th quiz as a study tool for the final. There should be 2 attempts on that. I saw earlier that I had that set for only 1 attempt, and I think I fixed that. So you should have 2 attempts on there. Any other questions or concerns? All right, guys, I appreciate you all. And thanks, Jonathan. It was a pleasure to have you again this semester. And I will see several of you guys this summer. And again, if anybody needs to meet with me via Zoom or have a phone conference, feel free to email me and we can set that up. Keep an eye out for that study guide this afternoon. Take care, guys.
Bye.
Later.
Thank you. Have a
Bye.
good summer.
Later.